So I'd like to now introduce Mamta Chaudhry. Mamta was scheduled to speak in March in person, and we are so sorry that we're not seeing her in person, but the excitement is that she is kicking off our very first virtual Meet the Author program. Mamta was born and raised in Calcutta. She went to graduate school in Florida. And while in one of her classes, she met Daniel Fryer, who has been her husband for 40 years. So that was good work, Mamta, great graduate school work. Her parents are from Punjab. She was brought up in Bengal, and she speaks many languages. She speaks Hindi, she speaks English, she speaks Punjabi, Bengali. She speaks pretty good French because I've heard her speak French. And from living in Miami, she speaks a little bit of Spanish and maybe even a little bit of Yiddish. She spends time each year in India and in France. And those of you who have read her book can feel Paris just by reading the words. If you've been there, it brings it back so very vividly. Her earlier career was in radio, classical music radio hosting. And she then went on to teach literature and creative writing. And Mamta, I think I'm correct that you have a PhD in English literature as well. So she is a woman of many, many talents. She and I bonded over music, over talking about classical music. For those of you who have read Haunting Paris, if you go to Mamta's website, www.mamtachaudhry.com, and you click on book and you scroll down, you will see music. And you will see that she has various artists playing for you all of the music that is mentioned in the book. So I'm thinking I'm going to go back and read the book for a third time and listen to the music while I do so. So with that being said, I would like to introduce to all of you the wonderful author of Haunting Paris, Mamta Chaudhry.
Thank you so much, Alison, for that beautiful introduction. I mean, that was like a musical prelude in itself. And thank you, Pam, for getting us all admitted and sorted out. I'm grateful to Rabbi Schönbrunn and to Congregation Torat L for letting me join you. And I'm very grateful also to the Women's League for Conservative Judaism for joining us tonight. And I know that people are here from everywhere. I had hoped to be up in Oakhurst in person, but I don't think we'll be getting on a plane anytime soon. And, you know, if we can't fly to Paris right now, in any case, they wouldn't let us in. Well, we can have Paris come to us, as Hemingway called it. It's a movable feast. And, you know, I really love what he said about Paris. He said, there is never any ending to Paris. We always return to it, no matter who we were or how it was changed or with what difficulties or ease it could be reached. Paris was always worth it. Well, Paris may not have an ending, but it certainly has a beginning. And for me, the first time I saw Paris, it just seemed so instantly familiar. And I couldn't explain why that should be. You know, it's so different in every way from the tropical Indian city where I grew up or the subtropical American one where I now live. So my husband, Daniel, who was trying to help me figure out this strange sense of deja vu, he said, well, maybe in another life, because, you know, he's married into a culture where talk of past lives is as common as your remarks about the weather. So the city seemed familiar, as it does to many of us, even if we've never been there, because we all have an idea of Paris, you know, formed by books, by films. But I wanted to discover the real city behind the shimmering mirage that we all conjure up in our imagination. But even before I set foot there, I was warned by friends, both American and French, that to cross the threshold, c'est difficile. And for me, it seemed more than difficile, it seemed impossible. I am so clearly an étrangère, a stranger, a foreigner, an outsider. So if you're like me, one of the joys of being in a new city is walking around, looking through lighted windows at night, imagining the lives that are going on there, like scenes in a film. And Paris is particularly a city made for flânerie, for walking wherever your feet and your fancy take you. But then all of a sudden, you hear a snatch of conversation or see something, a vivid image, and what had been aimless becomes an obsession. So here's what happened for me. One day I heard a drift of music coming down from one of the lighted windows, and I couldn't see who was playing, but I had this strong impression, this image of a man leaning forward and listening very intently. And I became fixated on that. Who is he? Why is he there? Why is he so intently focused? As you'll see, the man was Julien, whom the music had summoned back to the woman he loved and the place he called home while he lived, where he had unfinished business. So, okay, let me tell you, I didn't set out to write about Paris, and certainly not from this perspective. I'm not French, not Jewish, neither man nor ghost. But that was the voice that I heard, and I felt compelled to follow it wherever it took me. As a lot of writers will tell you, sometimes we don't choose our stories, sometimes they choose us. And so it was with this story. Haunting Paris is set in 1989 when all Paris, in fact, all France, is getting ready to celebrate the bicentennial of the French Revolution, that seminal moment in French history that gave us the glorious and inspiring motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. I mean, you can still see it on every public building, chiseled into every monument, wherever you go in France. But in the midst of all this jubilation, Sylvie is up in her apartment on Ile Saint-Louis, mourning the loss of her lover Julien, who had died a few months before. Then, quite by accident, she discovers in his desk a note, a letter. Now, she did know that Julien's sister and her two little girls were rounded up during the Grand Rafles, or the roundups of the Jews in Paris, and that they perished at Auschwitz. What she didn't know was that Julien believed maybe one of the little girls had managed to escape, and he spent his entire life secretly searching for the niece. So now Sylvie sets off on the quest for this unfinished business, but she has no idea that she's being watched by Julien's ghost. So her quest leads her back into the dark secrets of Julien's past, back from 1989 to the year 1942, those dark years of Nazi occupation of the city. And it was a time when France singularly failed to live up to its own glorious promise of liberté, égalité, fraternité. So this is a love story in which one of the lovers is dead. a mystery in which the detective is a pianist who is so cripplingly shy that her nickname is Sylvie La Timide. It's a historical novel which has really urgent resonances in the present. And it's a ghost story in which the ghost is the least terrifying thing of all. So people always ask me, do you believe in ghosts? Do I believe in ghosts? No, of course not. And yet, you are always in their company in Paris. You walk down these cobblestone streets and you feel that you're accompanied by a throng of people, and they're particularly thick on Ile Saint Louis. You know, you stand in the lamplight and aware of these presences, and you want to look over your shoulder and ask, who are you? What draws you back? And they retreat from you into the shadows and into silence. So my novel was written in the soaring presence of Notre Dame. A lot of the scenes are set in and around it. And as it happens, we were about to get on a plane to Paris, and the taxi was outside the door in a house in Miami. And a friend texted me and said, do you know Notre Dame is burning? So I flipped open my computer and I saw these pictures of the cathedral burning like some sort of filigreed luminaria. And I had tears just running down my face. And I couldn't explain why I should feel so personally bereft. You know, this is not my city, it's not my country, it's not my history, it's not my religion, but it felt somehow personal. And I know that I'm not the only one. There were millions of people around the world that felt that way when they saw this iconic image of Paris in flames. And maybe, you know, what Benjamin Franklin once said was still true, that everyone has two countries, their own and France. So we landed in Paris, not knowing what we would find. Would the cathedral even be standing, or would it be just reduced to ashes? So we got into a cab, and the taxi driver at the airport asked us where to, and I said, Ile Saint Louis. And he said, oh, no, 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 madame, c'est impossible. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? That's where we're staying, and we need to get there. And he just yelled and waved his arms the entire way there. And it made me a little nervous because, you know, he was taking his hands off the wheel, but he was clearly irate with us, as if we had caused the fire, as if it was our fault that all the roads were blocked. And I said, doucement, monsieur, doucement, just drop us as close as you can get us, and we'll walk the rest of the way. So we get to the Pont Sully, which is one of the bridges leading from the mainland to Ile Saint Louis. And so we start to get out, and he just jumps out of the cab and goes to a gendarme who's standing there blocking the entrance to the bridge. And he said, listen, I have some personnes âgées in the taxi, and they can't walk across the bridge with their luggage. And I'm going, old people? Who's he talking about? And my husband said, shh, be quiet. And so the gendarme waved us through, and we got to get off at the wrought iron gate of the apartment where we were staying. So we get settled in, and we cross the footbridge. You know, there are two islands in the Seine. There's Ile Saint Louis, and then there is its more famous and larger sister, which is Ile de la Cité, and that's where Notre Dame is. So, of course, everything is cordoned off, and there are police everywhere. And we walk across there, and it said no entry except to residents. So I asked the policeman there, I said, listen, clearly we're not residents here, and we're not even trying to get close to the cathedral because of everything going on. But could we go down to the Memorial de la Déportation, which is nearby? And he said, no, madame, je regrette, but it's a beau musée. Well, the Déportation de la Memorial is much more than a beautiful museum, just as Paris is much more than a beautiful city. You know, the city that I thought I was writing about, city of music, city of art, city of love, city of light. But behind the soaring towers of Notre Dame that reach for the sky is a museum that sinks into the ground. And it was at this museum where there is a bronze circle chiseled into the ground with the words, "They went to the end of the earth and they did not return." And then my hair stood straight up as I remembered the French word for ghost, which is revenant, one who returns. So that became the first line in my book. And I also had the answer to my question, what draws you back? So I know many of you have already read the book and some of you haven't, but just to give you an idea of this ghostly voice and the writer's voice, I'll read you the first page from my book um, and talk a little bit, and then we can chat together. Ooh, excuse me one second. This is not wine because I still want to be coherent while I'm talking to you. I'll save the wine for later. Okay, this is the first page in the book. They call us revenants, those who return. Restless for this world, we pass each other in mute recognition, for to be silent and solitary is our essential condition. But death doesn't end our thirst for a human touch, a human voice calling our name. And so I haunt these familiar quays, this familiar river. Music drifts down from Sylvie's window, and I linger until it comes to an end. The scent of lilacs on the breeze stirs dormant phantoms to life, but music is sorcery more potent. Though bound to time's measure, it exists on a plane beyond time, where there is no past and no future, there is only the present, in which the dead revisit this world. Night after night, I wait until the last notes fade away and Sylvie comes to the window at last. I retreat into the shadows as one after another the beautiful mansions along Quai d'Anjou spring to light, transforming those in the gloom below into a throng of ghosts. Occasionally, a passing figure pauses in a pool of lamplight to light a cigarette or glance at a watch. Squandered time, the most enduring of regrets. In the end, a lifetime is not enough. The heart yearns for more. Who can reason with desire? The heart has its reasons that reason cannot know. So that was the first page in the book. You know, I just wanted to show you what you probably read if you were expecting me up there this spring, was a hardcover, but it's now out in paperback. It's probably the only thing during these months of isolation that has lost weight. So the ghost voice that I read to you, maybe I heard it so clearly because, as Alison told you, I had once been a radio announcer in various cities, you know, in Miami, in Gainesville, in Calcutta, in Dallas. And it was a dreamlike existence. You know, you're sitting in this tiny room in front of a microphone, much as we all are today, And as a disembodied voice on the airwaves, I was able to enter homes that I would never have gone into otherwise, to be invited into lives that otherwise I would never have known about, I could only imagine. And so I was in their world, but not of it. And it occurs to me in retrospect that the ghost of Julien also was between two worlds in this twilight existence between the living and the dead, of this world, but not any longer in it. So as I followed Julien's ghostly voice wherever it led me, I found myself at the Shoah Memorial in the Marais, the Holocaust Memorial. And so I was sitting there. I had had before no idea that this was where the story was leading me. But it is a gift when you are led, and all you do is you follow that little thread of an idea into a labyrinth and hope somehow you will find your way out. So I'm sitting there, had asked the librarian and the archivist if they could recommend books I should read um, in order to know more about this time period. And I was just absorbed in reading when a gentleman came and sat down across from me. And he was truly a personne âgée. I mean, he was elderly, and he had the saddest eyes I've ever seen. And so the archivist came up and asked him, are you, ooh, look at this. Are you here to do research as well? And he said, no, témoignage. I'm here for testimony. And so as he was being led off to another room to give his testimony, he looked at the book I was reading, and it's called La Grande Rafle du Veldiv, which was the great roundup of the Jews in 1942. And he just looked at this purple cover of the book and he said, that I know. And it was such a moment for me to think that what I was researching, what I was imagining, was something that he had lived through. And I said, but it must be so hard to relive it, even in memory. And he said, yes, it's very hard, but it's very necessary. And in the course of writing this book, I met other people who shared their stories with me. One of them was this lovely French lady called Eva Danzon. And when she was a child, she changed her name to Francine and escaped from Paris to Nice, which at that point was not under Nazi occupation, although it would later become. And she was saved, but the rest of her family in Paris did not survive. So many years later, Eva came back to Paris, went to her parents' old apartment, and there was a neighbor there who saw her come in. And the neighbor said, I want to tell you what happened to your parents. Another neighbor who coveted their large and beautiful apartment denounced them as Jews to the local police. And they were taken away, and the neighbor moved into their flat. But he was always alone. Even his children wouldn't come to see him. And when he died, he was carried out on a stretcher. But your parents, they went to their deaths on their own 2 feet with their heads held high. And she said, I always knew you would come back, so I kept something for you. And then she pulled up a little ribbon or a cord. You know those little cords you have on bedspreads? They used to be really popular. So it was this golden colored cord, and Eva recognized it from her parents' bedroom. She knew it well. And then her son wrote a memoir based on that, and he called it Le Cordon, based on that little cord that was the only thing she had left from her parents. So Eva gave me the book, which is only in French, sadly. It's not in English, but it's her story. And then many years later, it was very moving for me that several months ago, when I finally had the book finished and in my hand, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, I went to her house in Paris and I said, here is the book that I wrote. And she went, about time. She's 95. And so I realized that's why so many people, after years of silence, were finally willing to speak up, to tell their stories. As that generation of survivors is dying out, they want to be sure that they bear witness, that they tell their stories, that they answer questions, and they do their part to make sure that when the whole world said, never again, we meant it. So we ignore what they have to tell us at our own peril. And it's a sad fact of life that we all know from our parents and our grandparents that the really important questions about the things that really matter in life, we don't think to ask until the only people who can answer them can no longer speak to us. You know, it happened with my parents. When the British left India, they separated it into two different countries. And my parents, who had always lived in India, suddenly found that India was no longer India. They were foreigners in what was now Pakistan. So they had to leave what was their home to go across the border to what was now India, but to them, a foreign country. And it's one of those sad ironies of history that a battle for independence that had been waged on Gandhi's principles of nonviolence should at the very moment of victory end with a bloodbath, and Hindus and Muslims were massacred on both sides as they were crossing this newly created partitioned country. My parents never returned. And many Jews in France also suddenly found themselves, the country they had called home for so long no longer considered them French. They were stripped of their citizenship and deemed stateless. And you know, it's one of the sops to the French conscience that they often say, isn't it amazing that only 5% of French Jews perished in the death camps as opposed to 95% of Jews from other countries? But you know, this is just an accounting trick, a sleight of hand, because if you count back in those who were first stripped of their citizenship, then 95% of French Jews also did not survive. And looking back, we always ask, why didn't someone do something? Were they afraid? Were they blind? Were they willfully looking away? And you know, it's interesting that now you don't hear of anyone who says I was a collaborator. They were all, everyone was in the resistance, okay? But so many of them were resistance of the dernière minute, the last minute ones who changed sides when they saw which way the wind was blowing. And that's when they started saying, oh, you know, I smuggled a Jewish child to safety. I sheltered a Jewish family. Well, if everyone who claims to have done that had actually done it, we would not be looking at that horrific and unimaginable number of 6 million. You know, we would all like to think that we would have joined the resistance, that we would be among the righteous among nations, those who helped Jews at great danger to their own lives with no hope of reward, during the Nazi occupation. You know, at the Shoah Memorial, behind that is an alley with a wall which has the names of the just inscribed on it. And as you probably know better than I do, at Yad Vashem, there is a whole avenue of trees dedicated to the righteous among nations. And there's a character in my book. He says, he's French, and he says that what he is proudest of in his life is that when his grandchildren ask him, "What did you do during the war?" that he can say, "I was among les justes parmi les nations." So I thought what I was writing about was safely in the past. But you know what William Faulkner says? The past is never dead. It's not even past. And we hear its ominous echoes in the present. You know, right now there are Jewish cemeteries being defaced with swastikas in Alsace. There are synagogues being attacked in Europe and here. And at this moment in India, in defiance of a constitution that guarantees everyone the right to worship whatever god or gods they choose, there is again an attempt to make citizenship contingent upon religion, once again setting up a terrible bloodbath between Hindus and Muslims. So one day people might look back and ask the same question of us. Why didn't they do something? You know, were they not aware of what was going on? Why didn't they speak up? And there's this poet, Audre Lorde, who says, "Your silence will not protect you." And you know, she's right. Because if we don't speak up for others, there'll be no one to speak up for us. As James Baldwin puts it, if they come for you in the morning, they will surely be coming for us that night. So here's one of my obsessions as a writer, and like all obsessions, it bleeds into everything that you do. I have always wondered what it would take to be the lone voice in a room to speak up when everybody else was against you. It would have been easier to remain silent. You know, if you've read E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, there's a young English woman who comes to India when it's still under British rule. And she goes on a visit to the Marabar caves. And there she accuses Dr. Aziz of rape. So you can imagine the outcry there is. And all the English on the eve of the trial, they meet at the English only club. Now, obviously, Indians weren't allowed there. And so they are all incensed and feelings are running very high. They're talking about the trial the next day. And then the schoolmaster gets up and he says, "I believe Dr. Aziz is innocent." Well, can you imagine the uproar, how he was called a traitor, an Indian lover? And he says, "Listen, I am waiting for the verdict of the courts. If he is guilty, I resign from my service and I leave India. In any case, I resign from the club now." And that always stuck with me, you know. But it was relatively easy for him. He was one of the ruling class. He was a man. He was, you know, of a certain age. He was very secure of his place in the world. But I try to explore in my book this character Sylvie, who is very young, very poor, of a different class, an outsider in Paris's high society, and to boot, cripplingly shy. What would it take for someone like that to speak up? You know, in the context of this particular story, silence is complicated. If you were in the resistance and you were captured and you were tortured to give up the names of other people in your cell, Well, staying silent then was an act of courage. But in other circumstances, it was an act of cowardice, even worse, of complicity. And as Sylvie realizes, courage doesn't mean being unafraid of doing something. It means being very afraid and doing it anyway. So, in the long course of writing this book, my relationship to Paris also changed. You know, at bottom, this book is a love letter to Paris. Not like Woody Allen's charming Midnight in Paris, which is like a funny Valentine, but this is as layered and heartbreaking as love can often be. So now I am, after all these years, if not exactly on the inside, at least no longer an outsider in Paris. One day, when I was looking through the panes of the Palais de Chaillot, the windows, at the Eiffel Tower, at this magnificent view framed by these windows, and then on the wall behind me, there was a stained glass panel from Chartres, and it was reflected in the same pane. So I'm looking at the Eiffel Tower, and I'm looking at this stained glass pane from Chartres. It's like the past is being superimposed on the present. And then I see this really unfamiliar face in the same panes of glass. And I'm taken aback until I realize that's my own face. Has that ever happened to you, that you're walking by a shop window or just accidentally see yourself out of the corner of your eye and you think, who's that? Well, that's what I thought it must feel like to be a ghost. And, you know, however well you know a place, in some ways, it always remains mysterious, as do people we love. Whatever stories we tell about them, mingling memory and desire, at some level, they remain a mystery. Only its ghosts know Paris. Okay, so that's what I had to tell you about my book. And now we can chat. Now, somebody is going to come up and ask the questions. Is that you, Allison, or should I be looking?
That is me. That is me.
Okay.
So I had a question here from Sandy. It was really about your parents' experience, from Sandy Wasserman. What percentage of people would you say had a similar experience to your parents of choosing to leave and make the best of it, choosing a new place or country to live because the old location had been renamed and religion was their chief reason for their decision?
Well, you know, there wasn't very much choice for them, I think, because Pakistan was founded as an Islamic state. And in India, you could, if you were Muslim, stay on, but it would be very difficult if you were Hindu or Sikh or Christian. Some did stay on, some did convert. So my parents, who were from Punjab, which is in the northwest, and then Punjab itself was divided, into Pakistan and India. So they came all the way east to Calcutta. And I was born long after independence. So I, grew up in a free country. But one of the things that has always been a great source of pride to me until now, and let's hope it doesn't change dramatically, was that in Calcutta, I had some Jewish friends visit, and there are 3 synagogues in the city. Okay, a lot of Middle Eastern Jews came there, and the liturgy they followed was the Baghdadi liturgy. So they were known as Baghdadi Jews. So we went up to the top of Magen David, one of the 3 synagogues, and looking out from there, I could see a Sikh Gurdwara, a Christian church, several Hindu temples, lots of mosques, and we were standing in a synagogue. And I told my friends, this is India. And that is very much the idea of India, as the sense that the French, if you were French, that is the idea of France, is that if you were French, you belonged. So I think that kind of struck me. And then also, I mean, sadly, now the older generations have died out and there aren't enough Jews in Calcutta for a minyan. But the synagogues are still maintained. So for my parents, they came to Calcutta. Sandy, I'm taking a long route to answer your question. But my dad was a river pilot. He piloted ships. So he came as part of the Royal Bengal Tigers, as part of the pilot service. And he had to be where there was a river, and in fact, a very treacherous river. So any ships coming in, at the mouth of the river, they would have to stop and the pilots would take them in. So from Punjab, which is funny, the name Punjab comes from 5 rivers. He moved to a place where there was one river, and that was Calcutta.
We have another question here from Susan Seferis. Was it as heartbreaking to write about the Veldiv roundup as it was to read about it? And I can attest to what Susan is saying. It was heartbreaking to read about it.
It was, Susan and Allison, that was one of the things that I had to keep breaking off and leaving it because it was so intense. And the strange thing is, when I went to Paris and I was researching this, there is no Veldiv. I mean, people don't talk about it. The building has been razed to the ground. There's a featureless block of flats there. There's a small plaque telling you, and even that you have to look for. So a lot of that history has been whitewashed. And, if you've read Tatiana de Rosnay's Sarah's Key, she wrote about it, and other people have written about it. But I didn't want this to be historical research that I found out these things. I wanted people to feel what it would be like to be snatched up in the middle of the night and to be carried to a place and held in a detention center and have Redke, Obersturmführer Redke, come there. And this is what he actually said about these children being there in a sort of cage. He said, I have come to survey my little bird cage. So yes, my heart pounded. I was just so involved in it. And even my editor, Nan Talese, who's brilliant and legendary, she said, wow, that part was hard to read. But as that gentleman whose name I never found out at the Memorial de la Shoah told me, he said, yes, it's very hard, but it's very necessary.
I have some questions that were submitted to me earlier that I'd like to go to. And for any of you who are listening, please do submit your questions on the chat. One of them was about the character Julien. He was a man who left his wife and his 2 children to be with Sylvie, who was his heart, his passion. But I wondered whether you made him a ghost because it made him more sympathetic as a ghost than for him to be alive and be real and have to deal with the tensions of what he had done.
That's an intriguing question. I've never been asked this before, so let me think for a second. Julien is not an Orthodox Jew. He is not even an observant Jew. And if you read the book, there is one scene where a character called Ari Wolkowski he says, but the one event that no Jew who lived in Paris at that time would have stayed away from, Julien would have been there. And indeed he was. I think a lot of it is that for many Jews in France, and I can speak for Julien because he's the one I know intimately now, um, he was French. He was married to a Catholic woman. She would not divorce him. So he had a choice to continue living in an unhappy marriage where they lived almost in separate worlds, which indeed after he died, they were in separate worlds, or he could snatch a last chance at happiness. And although Isabel is his wife, his legal wife, she never does let him go in that sense. It's a surprise to many people that he was with Sylvie for much longer than he was with Isabel. And the reason I think that I made him a ghost was not to make him more or less sympathetic. To me, he is sympathetic from the get-go. I loved him. He had to make a heartbreaking choice um, to create a new family. And it was heartbreaking for Sylvie. Everyone says, didn't she break up the family? She was in love with the whole family. The last thing she wanted was to break it up. So the reason I wanted him as a ghost is that one of the preoccupations in this novel is with time and with memory. Okay, so all of us know at the moment what it feels like to have time just blurring its boundaries. I mean, can you tell what day is it today? There's this sort of unreality to it. And then for a ghost who lives by an unearthly clock and a spectral calendar, time is much more permeable. The Salvador Dali painting, which shows the clocks just melting. And it's interesting that that painting is called The Persistence of Memory, because in this time and in Julien's mind, where the past and the present mingle, what is allowed to come up is not just his personal memories of living in a particular time, but the memory of an entire city that he as a ghost has access to. So I needed the ghost as like a skeleton key into different time periods, which I would not otherwise have been able to access.
We have a question from Linda Goldstein. Why didn't you have Sylvie have children with Julien?
Okay. He did ask her if she wanted children. I'm wondering if we're giving away a lot of the book, but I'll tell you this, and don't give any spoilers about what happens with the mystery, okay? It doesn't matter to me because you can tell me about any movie, and I've watched several movies before, read several books. I loved Allison's thing about the handheld device. Before there was Facebook, there was face in a book. But I think that for her, it was a choice to truly make these children who hated her part of her family as a way of atoning to them for having broken up their family. And also, she did not in any way want to cause a division or a separation between Julien and his children. So it was a conscious choice she made, and I feel fairly sure that she must have regretted it at times.
Another question that was submitted earlier had to do with the American couple who moved in. Sylvie divided her apartment, and this American couple moved in. And one of the questions was, did you have a specific purpose in including them, or did you just feel like you needed more characters?
Oh, goodness. At some point, I had to stop characters from coming in and say, all right, hold on. No, I had a very specific reason to have them there, okay? If I were writing this book only about the French, And then I was explaining about the origins of the croissant, or explaining something that would be very evident to someone who was French. It would be like when I read books about India and they go into great detail about something, and I'm going like, ah, if you're writing this for Indians, then why are you explaining what biryani is? But the Americans in the book are a stand-in for the reader, as they find out, as Will and Alice, his wife, the Americans who are there for the summer, find out things about Paris. It allows people, the reader, to enter into, oh, okay, I didn't know that bit of French history, which would have been completely transparent to someone who was French, but they act as a filter and a conduit for that for the reader. But I'll tell you another thing. We all know the central story about an American in Paris. The Americans go there, they discover themselves, they launch into their art, or with Hemingway into his writing. And the French are always background to the story, like wallpaper. So I wanted to write a story where Americans were in Paris, but they were just birds of passage. They came, they would leave, and the focus remained on the French living their own lives. And in a way, I think Sylvie is able to confide in Will and Alice in openly, because they are not connected to the story, they are not implicated in it. So there is much more frankness permissible. And they're also not part of the hierarchical structure, how the judge and his wife are so snobbish about the class distinctions. But the Americans are outside that, so they can be admitted more readily into the lives of the people there.
We have another question from Sandy Wasserman. What is your favorite book and what are you reading now?
Well, as you can see behind me, it would be very hard for me to pick a favorite. Can I just tell you a few that have greatly influenced me in my life as a writer? Sometimes books come into your life just when you need them. And one of them was Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which really, to a great extent, made me recommit to, this straight path to penury, which is known as fiction. And there's a scene in it, if you know the novel, you know what I'm talking about. There's a scene in it, a dinner scene, which has stuck with me ever since I read it when I was very young. And so when I did write my first novel, well, it's not really my first novel, okay? It's my first novel to be published, but I have others that have been rejected ahead of time. So let's just say my first novel that came out in the world. And it's interesting that it has a very central dinner party scene towards the beginning of the book, which if you read the book, you know that it sets a lot of the action in motion. And there's, as a coda, as a bookend, there's another dinner party, very different, towards the end of the book. Okay, so that's one. Another book is Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson, whom I was very fortunate to take some master classes with. And all my life, if I had to just, you narrow it down to one, it would be Shakespeare. I grew up in India and we were definitely left with the British system of education. So always Shakespeare. It's no accident that Will, in the book, the American professor who's there for the summer, is a Shakespeare scholar. Sandy, you asked great questions, so you clearly are a big reader yourself.
She does. She does. Here's another question. What, if anything, did you learn from the process of writing this novel that either surprised you or that really stayed with you in ways that you did not expect?
One of the things that is like the hot topic in the publishing world right now is who gets to tell which story, and there's almost like a publishing industry around Holocaust stories. And it almost seems like you could do the blank of Auschwitz and just fill in the blank and write a book. And in a lot of writing classes that I've been in or taught, the truism is write what you know. But I don't think that you should write only what you know, because otherwise we'd have a lot of very boring memoirs. And it's true that imagination knows no boundaries. You are not kept out by any walls, by any fences. I know that the Women's League, for instance, says they call themselves Sisterhood Without Walls, and we have doctors without borders. And similarly, I think you have writers without borders, because books also can cure what ails the world. So what I found out about myself that has stayed with me, one was the question that I still ask myself: would I have had the courage to do what some of these characters did? And I honestly can't answer that question, but I think for the rest of my life, I will keep trying to answer it. And the other thing is that I was writing about a city. I've written about Calcutta, I've written about Miami. And even for cities and people you have to do research. But when I was writing about Paris, I was like so daunted, thinking so much has been written. And if I get one street wrong, somebody is sure to come and tell me, but Madame, in Paris, this is not in this arrondissement, it's in the other. And if you get something wrong about Paris, Parisians will be so happy to tell you that. So if it was important to me to get that right, imagine how much more of a moral responsibility I had to get it right when I was dealing with the roundups and with the Holocaust. And one of the most gratifying things to me has been how many letters I've got from spouses or children of survivors who said, I'm glad you told it and you did get it right. So I learned for myself not to be so afraid in what I write, to dare to write a story that I think needs to be told. And I need to tell it to myself. So I didn't know about that time specifically, but I was writing what I know. I know about love. I know about loss. I know about longing. And this is set in a particular time and place. But in the particularity, in the granularity of these stories, lies the universal.
Mamta, thank you so much. We're pretty much out of time, but I'm going to give you one other quick question. Actually, I have a couple questions for you. We'll start with one from Susan Ferris. What was the purpose of the memory on the bridge?
Susan, can you just type in real quick for Allison while we answer the other one?
Okay.
What exactly you're referring to? Because the bridge is so central. Is it with Delphine? Is it?
All right, we'll wait for her to type that in and I'll give you another one.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts about what your next book will be? Now, I know you're working on your next book, so I don't know if you want to share that, but feel free if you do.
I am working on a book, and let me tell you, it's every stage of writing. It's like you think, oh, will I ever finish a book? Will I ever find an agent? Will she ever find a publisher? Will it ever get out in the world? So that was with the first book. Now with the second book, it's like a whole series of expectations set up. Will I be able to write another book? Will it be different? Will it be the same? So, I've made a couple of false starts. I am working on something. But as with the other one, I had no idea. I wish I were the kind of writer, like, oh, I don't know, Dan Brown, John Grisham, somebody who has a point A and they have a point Z, and they go straight from it. They do their research, they write this, sell millions of copies. And I'm like at point A, I think, oh, that's interesting. And then I get to point J and I go, wait, I need to go back to Paris to research this, which is not a hardship. I've decided I'm only going to set my books in places I really want to go back and do research. But if I knew at the beginning what the ending was going to be, I don't think I would feel so impelled to write it. So only when I reach the end do I have a sense of, okay, this is where I've been heading all along. I didn't know it, but now I can go back and make that narrative arc really clear. And let me tell you, it is not the most efficient way to write. But for me, that's part of the excitement of it. As Robert Frost said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. So I am waiting at my desk to be surprised by this new book.
Okay. And yes, I do have an answer from Susan Seferis. So the question is, what was the purpose of the memory on the bridge with Delphine?
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. So for those of you who've read the book, there's a little segment, almost a standalone segment in the middle, which is part of Julien's memories. Now, every ghost is different. There's not this one ectoplasmic blob that you can just co-opt as your ghost. So I had to set the ground rules for this haunting. And the ground rules were that whoever came back as a ghost could not let someone who was living see them, because once they had seen to the other side, they could never go back. So Julien loves Sylvie, comes back for love of her, but cannot afford to let her see him. And the whole thing with Delphine, okay, if you've been to Paris, even if you haven't, if you go Google the unknown woman of the Seine, okay, l'inconnue de la Seine, there's this beautiful young girl with a serene face who was found drowned in the Seine. And at the morgue, they made a death mask of her. And get this, the death mask became like a bestseller. They have postcards of it. You can still go into souvenir shops and find postcards. And she is so enigmatic and so beautiful. And everyone wants to know that story. So most stories written about l'inconnue de la Seine are, oh, she was abandoned by a lover, she was pregnant. And I wanted to have my own story of what happened to Delphine. And you will see who abandoned her. But it is also that memory on the bridge is a way for Julien to link the past, that time, with the present, with Sylvie, because he's keeping out of her way. Because if he didn't keep out of her way, what happened to Delphine might happen to her. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mamta. For those of you who have not yet read the book, or those of you who, like me, read it again, you will love the language, the use of words, the beautiful, beautiful, enchanting love story between Sylvie and Julien, as well as some of the tenser moments that have to do with history. If you find that you have questions once we end our webinar, please feel free to send them to Mamta on her website, www.mamtachaudhry.com. And Mamta, we thank you so much for being with us. I would like to make one other announcement. Well, a couple of other announcements, actually. Our next Meet the Author program will be on a Wednesday night, October 14th. We are going to have Ronald Balsam. He was the author. His first book was Once We Were Brothers. Almost everyone knows that book. And we will be doing his new book, Eli's Promise. as well as his previous book, The Girl from Berlin. We have dates already set up for December and January and March and on into the year. And as soon as we know who our authors on, we will let everyone who the authors are for those dates. We will let everyone know. But again, Mamta, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, I'm going to read the book again and listen to the beautiful music, especially my favorite composer, Chopin, and the Barcarolle. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Allison.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone, for joining us tonight.
Yeah.
We hope we will see you again at all of our Meet the Author programs in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.